of marginal, very marginal seats now that will determine exactly how this pans out. But a hung parliament is looking like the most likely scenario. Three country-based former Nationals, now independent MPs return: Tony Windsor, Bob Katter and Rob Oakeshott, and a Greens MP entering the lower house as well in the seat of Melbourne, winning that from Labor. There's the possibility of another independent in Tasmania in the seat of Denison as well, Andrew Wilkie, battling it out with Labor for that seat as well. So what's going to happen in the days and weeks ahead? Who is going to form government? And what is this going to mean in terms of a mandate, in terms of policies and how the parliament will work? Well, there are no hard and fast rules about how this negotiation takes place. But Sky News chief political reporter Kieran Gilbert, it's going to be an interesting few days ahead.
What a night, what a 5 weeks, and what a conclusion to it. The first time in 70 years that we've seen a hung parliament at the national level. We have got this election, really the nation pretty much in limbo at the moment, as the front page of the Sunday Mail in Brisbane says. In limbo nationally in terms of the overall count, in limbo in some of those key seats. Brisbane, the seat of Brisbane is there's a couple of hundred votes in it, probably less. The seat of Lindsay in outer Western Sydney is another one, and the seat of Corangamite near Geelong is another one, which is really coming down to a handful of votes. And when you've got a result which is pretty much a dead heat at this point, maybe slightly in the coalition's favour, those three seats, and Denison, as you say, the seat in Hobart, which no one had even had in the mix. Andrew Wilkie, this former Greens candidate, has performed really, really well, and through preferences, Labor's looking like it might lose that seat. So a lot of surprises, but what we did know was that this is going to be close, and it's extraordinary to see this result.
As expected, the big swing against Labor came in Queensland, where it's lost the bulk of its seats. The swing was also on in New South Wales, but they didn't lose as many seats there. Bennelong, the only definite one to be lost. Maxine McHugh losing to John Alexander, who takes this seat back for the Liberals, the seat, of course, that was held by John Howard for so many years, back into the Liberal fold. And Maxine McHugh made it pretty clear last night that she believes Labor's campaign was poorly run and poorly managed. She had a bit of a spray on the way out the door. I think we have some of Maxine McHugh. No, we don't have any of that. But Maxine McHugh, Kieran, was not too impressed, A, to be losing her seat, and B, making it clear where the blame lies.
No, absolutely.
Better news for Labor came in Victoria, where they picked up 2 seats, picked up a swing to them, also a swing to Labor in South Australia, but not enough, it seems, to win any seats there. And in the West, well, it's on track to lose that seat of Hasluck as well as Swan. Now, the two leaders, the contrast couldn't be different. They're both in a similar situation now, having to negotiate with the independents to try and form a minority government, but the tone was very different in the two rooms. For Julia Gillard, a flat response and a very sombre crowd in Melbourne, where the Labor Party faithful gathered. For Tony Abbott, well, it was nothing but celebration for the Liberals. He was trying to dampen down the excitement, but it's clear that this is an historic comeback in one term, to go from defeat, churning through 3 leaders, to now have Tony Abbott on the cusp of becoming Prime Minister if he can negotiate a minority government. That is quite a remarkable feat. Now, Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard, let's have a quick listen to both of their comments last night.
A government which found it very hard to govern effectively with a majority of 17 seats will never be able to govern effectively in a minority.
Friends, Bill Clinton once famously said in a previous election in America, "The people have spoken, but it's going to take a little while to determine exactly what they've said." And that is where we find ourselves tonight. Obviously, this is too close to call. There are many seats where the result is undecided, and where it will take a number of days of counting to determine the result.
And as for the Greens, well, Bob Brown, of course, also celebrating last night. Kieran, they've had a great result, picking up a lower house seat and control of the Senate.
David, the best result for a minor party in many decades. This is 11% or so for the Greens. They've picked up that lower house seat, a first for the Greens. At a general election, they had won the seat of Cunningham near Wollongong in a by-election back in, I think, 2002. But this is the first at a general election where the Greens have won a seat. So Lindsay Tanner's former seat of Melbourne goes to Adam Bant of the Greens. They've won a number of additional Senate places, and that's what makes this election result so interesting, because not only is it a hung parliament, it's a hung parliament with a very different political look in the upper house to that of the lower house. We've got a grab of Adam Bant now, the victor in Melbourne. Let's hear a little bit of what the new Greens MP had to say.
I want to say to everyone who voted for Liberal or Labor or one of the other minor parties that I will try and be a representative for all of you. And to all those people who today, for the first time ever, voted for Greens in the House of Representatives, you should go to bed tonight knowing that you and your vote has had a national impact, and you have done what no one else in the country could have done, although it does seem that we are potentially close in a couple of other seats around the country as well, which is superb news. But to all those people who voted Greens for the first time tonight, we've been telling you during the whole campaign that your vote is powerful, and it sure is.
Adam Bant there, delighted, as his crowd understandably was as well. He'll back Labor. He said it during the campaign that he would back a minority Labor government. So essentially, we can notch that up in the Labor column. But basically, at the moment, overall, it's pretty much a dead heat. It's depending on which analysis you look at, which conclusion you're taking from the AEC at this stage. They're not saying definitively beyond, I think, 70-70. And that's, as I say, dead heat. But the other ones look like there's a couple...
The likely way they'll fall...
Likely to the Liberal Party.
Incredibly close.
But still makes it... Yeah, absolutely. So it looks like 72, maybe 73, 72.
And there are no hard and fast rules about how a minority government is formed. Do the independents decide to go with the party that won the most votes, won the most seats? The incumbent, do they get negotiating rights first? There is no set rule about how this is done.
Do they go with a popular vote? Do they go with the number of seats? Yeah, absolutely. And with it's been 7 decades, so it's just a little bit before our time. The last time that there was a hung parliament at a national level, but it seems the last election we did, Tasmania, hung parliament 10-10-5. Today, it seems the Australian electorate, whether it be at state level or federal level, really ambivalent and divided about the political choices at the moment.
Well, it is going to be fascinating to see just how this plays out, how the independents negotiate, whether they do work as a bloc together in negotiating with both sides. I understand we do have one of these independents, Bob Katter, in Townsville, joining us now live. Bob Katter, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us. You're in the box seat. Can you give us any indication of Labor or Coalition? Which way are you likely to go if they come knocking on your door?
I go into this with no predilections at all. Really clean paper, and that's our responsibility to the people that voted for us in droves in our 3, and I'm told 4 electorates yesterday. All we are asking for in rural Australia is the right to survive. We have not had that right now for about 25, arguably 30 years. We've just continuously lost our population, lost our industries, watched everything collapse around us. Now, we want that reversed. And the democratic system and and the fighting people that stood behind the three independents, they want a fair go so that they can stay alive. That's all they're asking for, and that's quite literally true. At the end of the LNP's reign, we had a suicide every 4 days, a farmer committing suicide every 4 days in Australia. Now, is that something we want to be proud of as a nation? But if you solve the problem for us, we solved the problem for you in Sydney. Your overcrowding, your massive overpopulation problems, southeast Queensland, your massive overtaxing of your resources. We solved that problem for you. If you put some of those people back where they should be, in a civilised communities, rather than the rabbit warrens of the big congested cities.
Labor's wasted no time in making its pitch. They're talking about issues like broadband, which of course are important for the Bush and their plans for a national broadband network. What they're doing on water as well. And Julia Gillard, Bob Catter, I know you would have seen in her speech last night, she mentioned you all by name, congratulated you all, said she was looking forward to working with you. It was a fairly overt pitch. Do you feel like you're being wooed already?
We very much appreciate a reasonableness that I think we've got from both Julia Gillard and from Tony Abbott. But I'm not interested in anyone being nice to me, really. I'm interested in the right to survive for the people I've got. And if the democratic system has given us some power, I feel very, very strongly that's the way I'd like to exercise that power. And I made it quite clear throughout all this election campaign and all the last election campaign that the gong goes to whoever gives us the right to survive. Our freedoms are going, our property rights are going, our right to go fishing and camping, hunting, shooting. We're not allowed to boil the billy in Queensland without getting a permit to light a fire in the open.
Bob Catter, it's Kieran Gilbert here. I just wanted to ask you about in that context of you've made it clear you want to do what is in the interests of your constituents, and that's understandable. But what about the overriding issue of the number of votes of the parties? Will that play a factor in your decision as to who you back, the popular vote or the number of seats? Does the party with the greater number of seats have the greater right to sit down first with you, Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott and co?
I think these are factors that would be taken into consideration. Tony Windsor has made no secret of the fact, and he's the only one that has had experience. I've had experience from the other side. I was one of the 3 or 4 senior cabinet ministers in Queensland when we had only a majority of 3. And believe me, if the numbers are close, it is very, very difficult to govern, even if you've got a few seats up your sleeve. You'd still have to be very, very nice to Tiggy in the middle. But surely this is an opportunity for the leaders, whoever they might be, to acknowledge the necessity to have a rural Australia, to have agriculture, to produce our own food. We don't want to be a country that imports food, but somewhere between 9 and 15 years in the future, this nation will become a food importing country. Is that what Australians want? No, they don't.
Now, Bob Catter, you left the Nationals, so did Tony Windsor, so did Rob Oakeshott. What is your attitude towards the National Party?
Well, I thought the provocation by Barnaby Joyce and Warren Truss was not very clever last night. The National Party leader made a personal attack upon me, and I think if Tony Abbott was watching, he would have had a very big difficulty with what was said, and Julia Gillard would have had a smile on her face. But look,
there's not a lot of love lost there, is there?
Well, no. Personality is not going to be introduced here. Not from my side. They introduce personalities and personal attacks and comments. We're not going to do that from our side. We're really not. Nothing I've said here is condemnatory. No. We go to the table with a blank sheet of paper. We really do. And I got good friends on both sides of the parliament, and the people of Australia will expect us to act responsibly, and there are a number of factors that need to be taken into account.
You know, Bob Catter,
let me state for me that there's no way that I'm coming into some sort of a deal, if I personally had the power, unless I come out of it with the right for rural Australia to survive and have some of their freedoms restored, their freedoms to go fishing,
Yeah, well,
to go
okay.
camping.
You spoke about that, and also, you know, the other factors that will be part of the consideration, the size of the vote, the number of seats. In your view, from the two big parties, which is a more important issue, the popular vote or the number of seats, or does that not matter?
No, these things are things to be taken into account. I've given you my overriding consideration is the survival of the people that voted for me yesterday, and those that didn't vote for me as well. That's the overriding consideration. But let me just state to you that broadband is a very important issue for us. Privatisation has been super destructive of the bush. You know, it has been an absolute disaster for us, Telstra being a classic case in point. The second issue is the national energy grid, the clean energy corridor in Northern Australia, that will provide cheap renewable electricity ultimately for the rest of Australia.
So you like the NBN? The NBN is something that you support?
Cheap renewable, please let me finish, and cheap renewable petrol for the rest of Australia. Ethanol, Brazil fills up their tanks at 74 cents a litre, America 84 cents a litre, we're $1.38. I mean, is this a good arrangement? Well, they've both got ethanol, we haven't. I would see those sort of issues as very germane to what is needed in rural Australia.
So the NBN is something that you advocate?
Along with many other...
That is something that you would back?
You know, what I'm saying to you is it's a different mindset. I've referred in interviews to what happened in the dairy industry. There is a mindset there that says we're going down the free market, free trade, no developmentalism, no government contribution to infrastructure, and it doesn't apply to the cities, but it does apply to us, and it has been absolutely brutal. And I repeat, at the conclusion of the LNP's years in office, we were having one farmer commit suicide every 4 days in Australia, and from between 9 and 15 years' time, we'll be a net importer of food. I mean, that's how rural Australia's been treated. Some 2 million people, arguably, have left rural Australia to plough in and overcrowd Sydney and southeast Queensland.
Bob Katter, we do appreciate you giving us some time this morning, and good luck with those negotiations over the days ahead. It's going to be a fascinating period, and we wish you well for that. Now, Kieran Gilbert, listening to that, if anyone thought Bob Katter was a certainty to go with the coalition, I think again. For starters, as he pointed out there, the key issue is the right to survive in the bush. And when he lists the issues there, from broadband, an area where Labor is certainly with a more comprehensive plan, and the things that have upset him over the years, Telstra privatisation, dairy deregulation, coalition moves that have not gone down well in the bush, have not gone down well with the likes of Bob Katter.
And Warren Truss and Barnaby Joyce obviously got off to a good start with their diplomatic efforts last night. He's not happy.
Having a crack at Bob Katter, now he's in the box seat.
Yeah, not a good call at all. But in terms of the NBN, as you say, all of those points, one Labor person described Bob Katter to me as an old-time agrarian socialist. So don't think that he will be a national or coalition backer. He is very much a defending the worker, and as you heard there, his region, the ability to survive. So
and he said the number of seats, number of votes, one is going to be a factor in how they negotiate and who they negotiate with. But
A factor.
I think the bigger factor, listening to Bob Katter there, are the issues, are the policies.
Absolutely.
And rightly so. This is, essentially what government's all about. And on the issues, you'd have to say they line up, they mirror Labor's approach more so than the coalitions. Helen Daly has been listening along as well. She's there in Tony Abbott's seat in Sydney and Warringah this morning and joins us now. Helen, I'm not sure if you're listening to Bob Katter there, but we're just reflecting on the fact that it was perhaps more encouraging for Labor, those comments that he had to make, than for Tony Abbott.
Yeah, extraordinary comments, really. But, you know, in fact, it fits what Bob Katter has been saying over many years, David. I visited him in his seat, now some years ago. But, you know, the people up there love him. And as we probably remember, Bob Katter was a part of the National Party, but he was always a maverick. And he spoke out once too often against the powers that be in both the National Party and the Liberal Party. And so he really had to part company with them. He is not a natural ally of them at all. I think he made that fairly clear, even though he's saying that personalities aren't going to come into it. But he had a big laugh, but secretly, I guess, or underneath, he would be very, you know, thinking how silly it was for Nationals leader Warren Truss to, you know, have a bit of a go, and Barnaby Joyce. We know that the independent Tony Windsor, there is a lot of tension with Barnaby Joyce of the Nationals. And Kieran, you mentioned that term agrarian socialist. It is interesting. Bob Katter wouldn't really ever think that that's what he is, but that's really what he's talking about. They do actually want government involved in their lives. They do want government to provide things like broadband, and certainly those areas that he was saying deregulation has really hurt farmers and people in his seat. So it was really interesting to listen to Bob Katter's comments, and he wasn't going to give anything away, was he, about whether he's going to go for who has the most number of seats or who has the most number of votes. So it's all very well for both the parties to, you know, say we're the legitimate ones to form government with you. Those independents, this is their time to shine. This is their time really in the sun. And as we found when Brian Harradine, the Tasmanian independent, now some years ago again for those younger viewers, you know, he was able to get a lot for Tasmania through the Senate. I know we were talking about the Senate with him, but this is the independents' time to really shine for their electorate, and they will really fight for their electorate. And I don't think anyone should suppose that those three former Nationals lower house MPs would at all side with the coalition. And in fact, during the campaign, I interviewed Rob Oakeshott when it was looking more like it could be a hung parliament, which is exactly what we're probably going to get. And Rob Oakeshott was very clear about, you know, I'm not siding with one side or another, and it would be a big mistake if anyone thought that I was going to naturally side, he said, with the coalition. But Rob Oakeshott was also very sort of proper and wanted to make sure that everybody understood that he will be going through very strong process. He wants to make sure that the independents do their duty properly. He said they'll all be talking together at first, and so whether they've even had already some preliminary discussions between, well, the three of them at first. You've got three ex-National Party independents who are true independents. You've also got the Green, and you might have Andrew Wilkie, the independent in Tasmania, who actually has been a Green, but also who stood against John Howard, as you mentioned earlier, David. So I guess you can't expect him to go with the coalition either. So, look, it is going to be really interesting how this trading actually goes. And just back to one of the issues in Bennelong last night, where I was covering Maxine McHugh's seat, who lost it to the Liberal John Alexander, the tennis commentator and former Davis Cup player. Labor strategists there, certainly by the middle to late last week, were very depressed about the prospects in Bennelong, and that turned out to be true. But one of the issues they talked about was there's a very big Chinese vote in Bennelong. About 16,000 Chinese there, and they were very concerned about that. Those people particularly thought that the Labor Party had politically assassinated Kevin Rudd, and they were not happy. So Kevin Rudd again in the seat of Bennelong, very big factor. And of course the recriminations will keep going about within the Labor Party about what happened. How did they get to this point?
Helen, we do have to move on. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry,
David Lipson is in Brisbane, and David, This is the state where the blood was spilled for Labor last night. It's looking like a beautiful day there this morning, but not so much for the Labor Party.
No, not at all, David. It is a night that will be remembered as one for Labor where they were just simply belted around the park. It was something that was not entirely unexpected by any stretch of the imagination. All of the polls, well, for months really, have been pointing to this bloodbath in Queensland. And despite all the efforts that the Labor Party went to, even to the extent of changing leaders, changing the Prime Minister, it still didn't help them much in the end, because probably balancing out what was looking like a very unpopular time for Kevin Rudd was actually the way that he was deposed. A lot of people pretty uncomfortable with that. Kevin Rudd himself was pretty elated last night in the seat of Griffith. Just 2 months ago he was the Prime Minister, of course. Last night he was welcoming a victory as a local MP. Here's some of what he had to say at that function at the East Leagues Club last night.
You here in this room and all of them across Australia are the standard bearers of our movement. Standard bearers for the values for which we have stood for more than a century. Values of a fair go for all. Values of decency and compassion for those who need a helping hand. And values of building our great nation, Australia. Values for which we have stood since the first federal election was held in 1901.
So no great swipe from Kevin Rudd at the party that had deposed him, apart from the fact that on his campaign material, again in that room, the signs were for Kevin Rudd, sticking up for the South Side. There was no mention of the Labor Party or Julia Gillard in any of his electioneering paper or leaflets or pamphlets or the like, and that was a similar case last night. But certainly no overt swipe at Julia Gillard. The only thing that could be interpreted as anything negative towards the Labor Party was some comments he made on immigration. Of course, he did believe in a big Australia, and last night he said we should not apologise for extending the hand of friendship to people from other country. Foreigners who come to our shores are members of the Australian family rather than people to be rejected. And that received a very big cheer, one of the loudest cheers out of anything that he said in that room last night.
David Lipson, thank you very much for that. In Brisbane, we've got on the line the independent member for Lyne, Rob Oakeshott. Rob, we spoke to Bob Katter a little earlier. He says he's got a blank sheet of paper going into these talks with both sides. What's your state of mind as we face this extraordinary situation of what looks like inevitably a hung parliament, the first in more than 70 years nationally?
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. The state of mind is very happy this morning, very relieved in regards to a local election victory, and pretty excited about the opportunities both for the Mid-North Coast in what is looking like a close parliament, but also for democracy. I described it last night as a stimulus package for democracy. I think that's the best I can describe it again this morning. The very fact those that have traditionally fought each other along adversarial lines are now having to stop, reflect and think about how we're going to get stable and an outcomes-focused government for the next 3 years, I actually think is really healthy for the people. So this could be, if we can pull it off, a very exciting and enlightened moment in Australian public policy, and we can actually have a parliament that is focused on getting outcomes for Australia, not focused along political party lines or party loyalties, but focused on the genuine and real issues that face this country.
Rob Oakeshott, David Spears here. A stimulus package for democracy. It's, I'm sure a lot of voters will be excited to hear you say that, and the prospects this could present for genuine legislative reform. But before we get to a minority government, I'm keen on hearing what your approach will be to negotiating with the two parties. How are you going to tackle this?
Well, I'm heartened by the fact those conversations are already starting informally. Everyone is starting to talk to each other, so I don't think anyone's being silly about it, and that involves those in the major parties as well. Tony Windsor and Bob and I will all head towards Canberra probably tomorrow. We will have a look at the playing field. You'll know more than I would this morning. I'm not sure what the state of play is for those 3 seats still in doubt.
Do you go with the side who's got the most seats or the most votes? Is that a natural inclination, or is it just a clean piece of paper?
Yeah, oh, sorry, what's that?
Is it a clean piece of paper for you, or do you naturally, will you favour the side that's won the most votes or the most seats?
No, look, if I'm in play, my job description's simple. That is to focus on my electorate and my country through the parliament. I will want stable government and I will want a parliament that can deliver outcomes. Now, if I'm left with a decision, regardless of the numbers, where others in the parliament are opting out of the process and leaving it up to me and a couple of others to decide who the executive is, then I will stick by my job description and I will look for the best outcomes for my electorate and the best outcomes for my country. And for me, that blank sheet of paper is stable government and an outcomes-driven government. And if we can get good outcomes in this next parliament, I think it's going to be absolutely fantastic.
Rob, we heard again from the member for Kennedy earlier talking about the issues that are driving his mindset at the moment. It's great to hear your kids in the background as well.
Yeah, sorry about that.
the real Rob Oakeshott right from the outset. We like it, mate. And just tell us, what are the issues driving you in your seat? Broadband was one of the things that Bob Catt has said was an important one to him. Tell me some of the things that you see as crucial to your constituents, particularly.
Yeah, you're breaking up a bit, Kieran. Look, you there?
We can hear you. I just wanted to get the sense of what you feel are your key priorities in your constituency. We heard the broadband issue is one, and government being involved in infrastructure for Bob Catt is a big priority.
Yeah, that's right. And look, broadband's part of a bigger theme for us, and you just experience it then. We've got about 500,000 people on the mid-north coast who are completely disenfranchised in regards to telecommunications generally. I have trouble getting phone lines to Sydney at what is a critical moment in Australian public policy. I can't get a live line out of the mid-north coast to do any TV interviews. This is an example of the disenfranchising of regional Australia in telecommunications, and so hopefully that point is being made loud and clear by this, and that's one issue. But also we have got some ongoing services pressures. We're one of the highest growth rate areas in Australia, yet services aren't keeping up. Largely it is because of some issues around a Sydney-focused state government. But likewise, federally, there is a frustration that in growing regions, services and government delivery doesn't keep pace. So in health services, we've got a shortage of beds. In education, we're on the squeeze in regards to tertiary education facilities and opportunities. And then issues around employment and the ability to create jobs in this local area because of the lack of support of government in the past is a real challenge. So ours is the service issues shaped around growth. We have a demographic that is the oldest in Australia, some of the poorest in Australia, comparatively some of the lowest income levels in Australia. We've got some real challenges here, and hopefully this is going to put the spotlight on them and government has to play.
Rob Oakeshott, we'll let you get back to that breakfast with the kids. Thank you so much for joining us, and that line breaking up as we go, demonstrating one of those big issues for you there in the regional parts of Australia. Thanks for joining us this morning, and good luck the next few days.
Okay, thank you.
So, Kieran, just reflecting on that, we've now heard from Bob Catt and Rob Oakeshott in the last half hour, two of the key independents who will decide who forms government, it seems. And once again, coming through on the message there is that broadband is important and services for the bush.
Yeah, and, you know, the issue of the number of seats, the popular vote, they're secondary. They're secondary to what those two gents are saying.
But Rob Oakeshott was saying he wants stable government.
He wants stable government.
Which would indicate the party with the most seats.
I'm not necessarily sure of that, because I think if you look at what's happening in the Senate, the Greens have got the majority in the Senate. And if you're going to have a stable government, it's got to have a government that can get its agenda through. And the Greens, as you know, would be more inclined to back a Labor agenda. So I think that's a little bit blurry. And we still as many things are this morning.
Yeah, they are. We still don't know who's going to have the most seats, that's for sure, because quite a handful are still being counted, are too close to call. But again, I don't think Labor will be discouraged by the messages coming there from Rob Oakeshott and from Bob Catt earlier about the issues that they want to see addressed.
Absolutely. Well, broadband was one that both of them focused on, and telecommunications, specifically there with Rob Oakeshott's phone there from the North Coast and mid-North Coast. But intriguing, and he describes it as a stimulus package for democracy, this this hung
great line.
parliament's a great line, absolutely. Hopefully, fingers crossed, that's the best case scenario. A limbo and a deadlock is probably the other side of the coin. Hopefully, it's what he says.
He also said that talks informally have already begun, so approaches clearly have been made.
Yeah. And they're heading to Canberra tomorrow.
Will head to Canberra tomorrow. It seems the other independents will as well, and we know that senior figures from both Labor and the Coalition are heading there tonight. So it is going to be Canberra that's going to see the scene of these talks in the coming days, as both sides try to form a minority government with these independents. And we see where the dust settles on a couple of these other seats as well. Whether the Coalition can form a minority government or not, they're certainly celebrating the success that they have had last night in picking up particularly a swathe of seats in Queensland. Some gains elsewhere, most notably the seat of Bennelong in Sydney, where John Alexander has knocked off Labor's star candidate from 2007, Maxine McHugh. And it was John Howard, of course, that Maxine McHugh defeated famously in 2007, ending the Prime Minister's term in Parliament, a sitting Prime Minister knocked out. Well, John Howard was celebrating the fact that the Liberals had regained his old seat last night and celebrating the fact that Tony Abbott now has a real chance of becoming Prime Minister. Kieran, you spoke to the former Prime Minister last night at the Liberal function in Sydney. Let's have a look at what he had to say.
What happened tonight is an extraordinary tribute to Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott brought us back from the political dead when he took over 9 months ago, and his willingness to confront Kevin Rudd on the emissions trading system began the decline of Rudd, because Rudd lost his nerve over that, and it was all downhill from then on. And I think what's happened tonight is, at the very least, the legitimacy of the Labor government has been destroyed, and it's a remarkable triumph for Tony Abbott. He brought unity and cohesion to the coalition. They worked together as a team. He had a clear message, and he showed tonight with his speech a generosity of spirit, and the Australian people were warm to that. I've always seen in Tony Abbott a great personal decency, and the more people see of that, the more they will like it, and he will become an extremely formidable figure in Australian political history.
There were many that thought his discipline resembled a Howard approach to politics. How often did you speak to him during the campaign?
Tony Abbott and I are good friends, everybody knows that, but he's his own man. Every leader of a political party makes his or her own way, and sure, we have some attitudes and things in common, but what Tony has achieved tonight... Look, I talk to Tony from time to time, but look, there's only one man who's entitled to the credit for this, and it's Tony, obviously assisted by his parliamentary colleague. But I'm so happy for him, but more importantly, I'm so happy for my party, and even more important than that, I'm happy for the country, because a quite bad government has not got the second chance it never deserved.
What about the seat of Bennelong? That must be a bit of sweet revenge to get that back into the blue corner.
Well, I'm delighted for John Alexander. He was a great candidate, and they needed a new, fresh face in Bennelong, obviously, and I'm just so happy for him as well. It was great. He had a very big win. He got a swing of over 5%.
But you were the member for Bennelong for so long. It must be nice.
Of course it's
Personally.
nice. Of course it's nice. And it's a very marginal seat now. And it's just one of those seats that over the years changed a lot. And it went Labor and for 3 years, and they woke up to the fact that wasn't very good. And they've put it back into our camp. But this is a remarkable night in Australian politics. And it is, above everything else, a tremendous tribute to Tony Abbott for his tenacity and his high intelligence and his humanity.
It's very late. I know you've got to get home to bed. I think I might do the same. But I want to ask you one last thing about the way forward, because you're experienced, you know how these things work. Both sides are trying to position tonight on the way forward, the negotiations with the independents. How does it play out? I mean, this hasn't been seen since World War II, this sort of hung parliament.
You are facing a sort of, in some respects, a Coles and Wilson. They were the two independents after the 1940 election. It's a bit like that, but my experience tells me that the leader of the coalition, Tony Abbott, has the skill and the brains and the knowledge and sense of Australian history to know how to negotiate, and he doesn't need any public advice from me. I'm sure he'll do it well, and the Australian people will grow to respect him even more in the years that lie ahead.
Well, John Howard talking to Kieran last night, that was after midnight, but he certainly wasn't looking too sleepy there.
It was close to 12:30 and 12:30 p.m. So what, about 7.5 hours
You
ago?
could see in the room a lot of celebration going on.
The complete antithesis of what you saw at the Melbourne Convention Centre, where Ashley Gillen was.
Yeah, and she joins us now from Melbourne's, backing up this morning as well. Ash, we've been talking to a couple of the independents who are now in the box seat of determining who's going to form government. What they've had to say might put a bit of a smile on Labor's face, because the issues they're talking about as being important for them in the bush, broadband in particular, service delivery, and you know, the Nationals will argue that they are the party of country Australia, but these guys aren't particularly good friends of the Nationals necessarily.
Well, no, not at all. There's no guarantee of what side these independents will go with. And of course, we heard them saying they are, you know, talking together and looking like they'll vote in a sort of block. But it does, of course, depend on the final count. We still don't know the outcome of a couple of seats. It looks like there has been a swing of over 5% away from Labor nationally. Of course, a bloodbath for Labor up in Queensland, not as bad as Labor thought in New South Wales. Here in Victoria, a swing to Labor. And here we've seen Labor pick up a couple of really key seats like McEwen, of course. That's one that we're not too surprised about. Fran Bailey, of course, the Liberal former MP, did retire at this election, so that helped Labor in that seat. Latrobe, though, a bit of a shock, I would think. I caught up with the Liberal MP Jason Wood on the campaign trail a couple of weeks ago when Tony Abbott was out campaigning in West Kinglake, and he seemed pretty confident then that he would retain the seat. So I think he'd probably be waking up feeling a bit shocked this morning. Of course, the other big headline here in Melbourne is the seat of Melbourne, which the Greens have managed to pick up after Adam Bant secured a 10 to 12% swing, we understand, towards the Greens. Bob Brown, the Greens leader, is flying here to Melbourne to celebrate today. He's going to be holding a news conference with Adam Bant at about 2 o'clock this afternoon. So, of course, we'll bring you that. But fascinating to see where those independents will go, not just on the broadband issues, of course, which are really important, but I think the power of the independents might put a smile on the Greens' face as well when it comes to climate change. I know that Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor have been advocating stronger action on climate change. I'm pretty sure that Rob Oakeshott voted for the emissions trading scheme, so perhaps, you know, this will put the issue of climate change back to the forefront as well.
Yeah, actually, that's going to be fascinating to see. We might take some horse trading, no doubt, on the cards. Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott neck and neck in the seat count, now having to rely on these independents, it would seem, to form government. Over the next hour, we're going to talk to our reporters across the country, look at the results, how the outcome fell, where Labor lost the most number of seats and why, and whether the recriminations are going to centre on the decision to get rid of Kevin Rudd. First up this morning, we're joined by someone who did play, well, perhaps a bigger role than many expected in the election campaign. Mark Latham, the former Labor leader, joins us this morning on Sky News. Mark Latham, welcome. Are you surprised by this outcome?
Oh no, it's within the band of probabilities that were identified in the published polls, consistent with what many people were saying prior to the election. There's some interesting features. In every election you come up with results that go against national or statewide trends. I thought one of the most interesting things was that in New South Wales, where Labor lost 4% of the two-party preferred vote, they've only lost 4 seats. And in fact, they've hung on remarkably well in Page, Eden Monaro, Robertson, which is the result. They talk about the bellwether seat, it's now the telltale seat about what happens, and Dobell. So whereas the coalition seemingly have got 9 new seats in Queensland, they would be somewhat disappointed and frustrated that the 4% swing in New South Wales didn't harvest a bigger result. So there are some surprises, seat by seat, state by state, but overall the result is very close to what
Who do you think is,
the informed polls were saying beforehand.
That's right. Who do you think is most likely to form a government in this situation?
Well, I had a squiz at the AEC website this morning, and it seems that if the results, as they stand at the moment, that is prior to further counting today and through the week, if they stand, you would expect the Coalition to have 73 seats, Labor to have 72, and the gang of five that have emerged as the power brokers, the kingmakers in this situation. How will they break? It seems that Brandt, the new Green in Melbourne, is in the bag for Labor.
Yep.
That brings them up to 73. Andrew Wilkie, is he going to support the Liberal Party that really propelled him into politics with all that
And he ran as a Green before.
chicanery about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq back in 03 and 04? It's unlikely that you could envisage Wilkie. So maybe Labor's got two in the bag. Bringing them up to 74.
And
it
those
depends on
country
how.
independents?
Well, the country independents, of course, they put a big emphasis on stability. What that is code for, of course, is the fact that if you're an independent without a party machine backing you, now at the centre of Australian politics, the last thing you want is an early election. The last thing you want is some sort of problem in the parliament that propels people back to the polls in March. Or April next year.
Because they could get knocked off.
Well, they get knocked off, they lose their place in the limelight, they lose their balance of power potentially. Every independent, their greatest fear is an early election. You've got no party machine, you've got the unpredictability of what happens in their own constituency. So when they talk about stability, what they're saying is give us 3 years. As the kingmakers, give us 3 years.
To control the policy.
Control the parliament, the policy, all the agendas that they might have for their own constituency and their own ideology. So stability...
And you can understand that.
I mean, these blokes present themselves as sort of saintly figures. But stability is code for politicians saying,
look,
I've got some power now, I'm hanging on to it, and you're not taking it off me with an early election in March next year.
They spend years being ignored, finally they get a chance.
Oh yeah, sure. But let's just understand what they're talking about here. That there'll be highfalutin talk about public policy issues, there'll be highfalutin talk about the good of democracy and stability and all these things. But you can be guaranteed that, as old Jack Lang used to say, self-interest is the hardest trying horse in the race. And the self-interest of those country independents is to hang on to the power they've got now for 3 years, not 6 months.
Whatever happens in these negotiations, one thing we know is there's been a swing against Labor, particularly in Queensland and to a lesser extent in New South Wales. Why? What do you put that down to? Well,
state factors obviously stand out in New South Wales and Queensland. In Queensland, it's a huge swing back to the coalition. I mean, 9 seats is a big swag to harvest in a national election. The Rudd factor played strongly in Queensland, there's no doubt about that. And the fact that Labor ran such a problematic campaign. I mean, the Citizens' Assembly on climate change. I mean, probably the greatest joke policy that it's ever been presented on a big issue by a major party. The admission, I think the most stunning admission you'll ever hear in Australian politics by the Prime Minister mid-campaign that she was being shackled by the minders. She needed to transform herself from the old Julia into this new person. Nothing much changed on the campaign trail, but it was an admission that her campaign was fake, it was choreographed, it was orchestrated by a bunch of backroom players, and that in itself, I think, played into the perception that it was Arbib and Feeney and all these machine men pulling the Gillard strings.
Now, what about your role? Because you popped up on the campaign with Julia Gillard, with Tony Abbott, and that was seen by many in Labor as a distraction as well. I mean, do you take any blame for creating instability and trouble for Labor's campaign?
David, I was a humble commentator doing my job. I wrote some articles for the Fin Review. I did a couple of good interviews here on Sky, and I put together what I thought was a pretty fair report for 60 Minutes. My role was very, very minor indeed.
But it was something that drew a lot of focus. The day you confronted Julia Gillard, comments that you made about her and the decision to get rid of Kevin Rudd. You don't think some in Labor would have any justification to be blaming you in part for what's happened?
Well, these were statements of the obvious. You had Labor spinners trying to say Rudd wasn't the leaker. Well, what an amazing coincidence that when they got him back inside the tent, the leak stopped. I mean, that was just incredible, wasn't it? That was just truly amazing that those two things would come together. The discussion with Julia Gillard, I asked her for an interview, what she had to fear from sitting down like this and having an interview with me for 60 Minutes, a high-rating program. I'm still wondering why she didn't agree to have the interview.
So no guilt?
No whatsoever. I was just doing my job as best I could and making statements of the obvious, letting people know some of their democratic rights. You've got the AEC out there giving people the impression you've got to fill in all the squares. In fact, it's a form of voluntary voting. Once you're compelled to go to the polling booth, you don't have to fill in all the squares. And I inform people of their democratic rights.
And urge them to do so. And I know the informal vote's gone up.
It has, from 4% to 5.7%.
You take credit for that?
Oh, no. You see what'll happen now, and obviously this will feature in your coverage, is that everyone in the bubble looks at all the postal votes and changes in seats. But the big story, really, for the Australian people was one of disillusionment and disengagement. Don't forget all the media criticism about the nature of the campaign. Very little policy difference, very little that was worthwhile for the Australian people, and their response was a bigger informal vote, a bigger protest vote with the Greens. Probably you'd find a bigger donkey vote. And a majority of people saying, look, if this was voluntary voting, I wouldn't go and turn up because it's not worthwhile.
We saw Maxine McHugh last night criticise, after losing her seat at Bennelong, the Labor campaign for not being well managed and well planned. The recriminations, I would imagine, they'll keep a lid on while the negotiations are underway with the minor players, the independents. But if Labor can't scrape together a minority government, how bad are things going to get in Labor? The recriminations, is this going to be a bloodbath?
Well, you're right in saying that they want to look respectable for the time being if they can sneak back in with a minority Labor government supported by Brandt and Wilkie. But when the lid comes off, it'll be volcanic, as one would expect. Looks like a net loss of 16 seats for the Labor Party, shambles of a campaign, a first-time leader who's done very poorly. So they're going to have major problems, and of course you've got the added factor of they all know Rudd was the leaker, and the reckoning with him, of course, will be absolutely fascinating. So Labor's got a whole bunch of issues there because they've lost ground. The coalition, I suppose, will be more united because they've gained ground.
Will Julia Gillard survive this if she doesn't win?
Oh, not in the long term. I mean, the factions use Labor leaders for power. And if they can't deliver power that then delivers other forms of factional patronage and postings, then of course the leaders have expired on their use-by date. That's why they got rid of Rudd. The right-wing machine is only using Gillard from the left for the purposes of this campaign. It hasn't worked for them, and I'm afraid she's sitting in the transit lounge of Labor leadership, and it's only a matter of time before they move her on.
Who's next, do you think? Who should be next, and who do you think will be next, if that happens?
Well, what do? Swanee would be putting his hand up as a safe pair of hands, offering some sort of continuity and stability. People talk about the next generation of Labor leaders, Shorten and Combay, but you know, they've got difficulties. They've probably got more scandals in their personal lives than Mel Gibson. So I'm not too sure they're going to be propositions in the short to medium term. It's a crisis, really, because they ditched Rudd, they've burnt off Gillard's effectiveness, and they haven't got a lot in store. I suppose they do turn to Wayne Swan as the safe Queensland option. Ho-hum.
All right, Mark Latham, thanks for joining us this morning.
A pleasure. Thank you, David.
Interesting result. We'll get into where these seats have fallen. We'll get around the country and look at the states. We'll start in Queensland and have a look from top down at what happened last night. As you can see there, the coalition picking up Leichhardt in the top, Herbert, which had been redistributed to a national Labor seat, and then Dawson as well around Mackay, Flynn too also around Gladstone, all going to the coalition. The coalition sweep continued closer to Brisbane. As you can see there, the seats Fisher, Dixon, Longman and Ford all going to the coalition. A sea of blue in Queensland, and then once we get into Brisbane itself, once again you see the seats changing colour there. Bonner, Brisbane changing colour, Labor holding on in Petrie, but the swing in Queensland was, Kieran, where the damage was done.
It was absolutely. It's where the Rudd slide was reversed in this election campaign. We've seen it right down the coast and in different sorts of seats, from the inner city seat of Brisbane, which remains in limbo.
Let's have a look at that result. We've got Brisbane specifically. Let's have a look at what the latest count is there. If we can bring up the count in Brisbane.
This is one of those seats that remain undecided and that will decide the outcome. If we can just look at the two-party preferred breakdown of that, it's tiny, the difference there. Yeah. So Theresa Gambaro This
You'd
is
say your favourite to hold on to that.
I
based on
would say absolutely. The LNP ahead in Brisbane. And Teresa Gambaro is a former member for Petrie, north of Brisbane, but a well-known local face and name, and she's got to claim a little bit of credit here as well, not just the swing against Labor. I think there's a couple of percentage points there for Teresa Gambaro personally.
Let's go back to the map and look at New South Wales. Now, New South Wales, we saw in the country areas, Labor holding on to what it had. So Eden Monaro was the one that was in play, and it managed to hold on to that down in the bottom there. But when we get closer to Sydney, in and around Sydney, look at the changing colours here. Macquarie going to the Coalition. Macarthur, which was just southwest of Sydney there, stays blue. It had been a notional Labor seat, but the Coalition picked that up. But importantly, Labor held on in Robertson on the central coast there to the just to the north of Sydney. Deborah O'Neill beating the odds there at a seat that was Labor's most marginal in the country. She beat the odds, clung onto that seat.
David, I think we should point out, if you bring it to Lindsay as well there, Robertson and Lindsay and Petrie for that matter, three good local candidates or local members who have stemmed the tide there. I think those local members and candidates really, you need to look at the quality of those candidates to see those results.
In Sydney, as you can see, there Bennelong changes to blue, so Maxine McHugh losing that seat to the Coalition. But Labor holding on to Greenway just, and Lindsay looked like holding on. Let's bring up the numbers for Lindsay. As you can see there, David Bradbury he's just ahead on the final count last night anyway.
And the
83% counted. And have a look at that.
Yeah. You'd be leaning towards David Bradbury there as well. I'm told that the postals, the postal votes tend to favour the incumbent. I think Bradbury will get across the line there and as I said, he's been there for a long time. He's a well-known face. Deb O'Neill in Robertson, well-known on those Central Coast beaches. And Yvette Darth has been a good local member in Petrie. I wouldn't discount the factor of those individuals holding a percentage point or two and keeping this as close as it is. Otherwise, it would have been a complete wipeout.
That's right. Let's have a look then at Victoria. Go back to the map and have a look at Victoria. As you can see there, the seat changing colour is McEwen, which Labor picked up with a swing to them across Victoria. So McEwen to the north of Melbourne, and then as you get closer to Melbourne, also Latrobe. Have a look at this seat changing colour there around the Dandenong Ranges.
And have we got Corangamite to bring up those numbers?
Corangamite, let's bring up the numbers. This is the big seat around Geelong in the south of that map there. Corangamite's numbers where this seat is still too close to call.
That's the Great Ocean Road and up to is it the town Como, I think it is?
Sarah Henderson is the Liberal candidate there, a former ABC presenter, well known and a very strong local candidate. After preferences, have a look though at how close this one is. Very close indeed, but Darren Cheeseman would be favourite to hold on to that. It would seem a lot of postals to come in and pre-poll votes to be counted there because it's just under 80% that result counted last night.
Yeah.
And in Melbourne itself, let's go back to the map, no net change for Labor. So they might have, a loss to the Greens there, of course, but they might have had some hope in seats like Dunkley and Aston, but they didn't turn into seat gains. A seat loss there, as you can see, in the middle to the Greens. Melbourne, that's Lindsay Tanner's old seat. It goes to the Greens. They win a lower house seat. They've held a lower house seat before Cunningham, but that was won in a by-election. This is the first time they've won a seat in a general election.
And in terms of the actual, as we go forward, David, it doesn't really change the net outcome for Labor because Adam Bant has said that he would back a minority Labor government. So in terms of that loss, it's one of their better losses because Green really will mean backing a minority Labor government over a minority coalition.
And in Tasmania, this is worth a look as well. Labor was expected to hold on to everything there. The map is showing us that, yes, Denison hasn't changed colour yet. That's the Hobart-based seat of Denison. But let's bring up the figures, if we can, for Denison, because that's where Andrew Wilkie, as we were talking about earlier, has surprised everyone. His primary vote, he's running third, but with the preferences of Greens, he was a Greens candidate previously. With those preferences, he'll be pushed into contention and pushed in front. So this one, is close, but it looks like Andrew Wilkie is going to win that seat and become an independent. Again, being a former Green, he, of course, came to fame as an ONA officer who quit in protest at John Howard's handling of the Iraq War. You would expect that he would lean more towards Labor, towards the left, but we just don't know.
No, you don't know. It's interesting talking to the two of the other independents, Bob Katter and Rob Oakeshott this morning, former Nationals, but they say that their sheet is clean as they go into these talks. Yep. And that they've got a certain guiding agenda, and that is what's best for their electorates, first and foremost, and for the nation. We've got a grab of Bob Katter, I understand. Let's hear a bit of what Bob Katter had to say to us.
I go into this with no predilections at all. Really clean paper, and that's our responsibility to the people that voted for us in droves in our 3, and I'm told 4 electorates yesterday.
Encouraging for Labor as well there, David, was Bob Katter and indeed Rob Oakeshott, whose phone was cutting in and out. You know, it was quite timely when we spoke to him, was the focus on the NBN. They both sound very, very supportive of a big investment in that broadband network.
Telecommunications in general, they both, of course, well, Bob Katter in particular, opposed the privatisation of Telstra, and he listed that as one of the big issues. And dairy deregulation as well under the Howard government is one of the big issues that I guess he's angry at the coalition over. So not a lot of love lost there for the coalition. Very hard to read which way these country independents might go, but they've told us this morning that informal talks are underway already. Let's continue looking at the map quickly at the remaining seats here. And in Adelaide, no change at all. Labor had hoped to pick up Boothby. But Andrew Southcott's held on there, and so has Chris Pine in the seat of Sturt. The swing was to Labor, but not enough in South Australia to win them any seats at all. If you go north from there to the Northern Territory, let's have a look here at a seat, Solomon, that has changed hands and gone to the coalition, the Darwin-based seat there. And finally, over in the west, well, a couple of interesting results. Firstly, have a look at O'Connor. Wilson Tuckey has lost his seat after how many years in Parliament?
I think he arrived at the same time as Bob Hawke in
he told us
1983.
Well, that's when Bob Hawke became Prime Minister.
1980, I think it was.
1980, yes. So the Nats have taken that seat of O'Connor from Wilson Tuckey. In Perth itself, finally, have a look here. This is where Labor they've lost the seat of Swan that was notionally redistributed to them, but had a sitting Liberal MP. But that seat of Hasluck, the graphic there shows us that they're clinging on. But let's bring up the figures, if we can, for Hasluck and have a look at how the vote counting finished last night in Hasluck. As you can see there, Sharon Jackson is fighting off Ken Wyatt, who would become the first Indigenous member of the lower house in Parliament after preferences. Have a look here at how that battle is shaping up.
If we can see the two-party, just in front. That's very, very close. And still, David, 25% of the vote yet to be counted in Hasluck. So I think it is, you know, a lot of the pundits are suggesting, you know, projecting that as Liberal win. Probably, but I think it's too early to say with 25% of the vote yet to be counted.
One that's going to be interesting to see. Now, Julia Gillard last night, of course, there was a sombre Labor crowd as they saw these results come in and realised that majority government had slipped out of their reach. And Julia Gillard wasted no time when she made some comments late in the evening in wooing those independents. Have a look.
As I acknowledge the election of these independents and a member of the Greens to the House of Representatives, I have had a good track record in the federal parliament, working positively and productively with the independents in the House of Representatives and working with the Greens in the Senate. I believe in respecting the role of every representative in the House of Representatives, including the independents and the Greens.
Ashley Gillan was there last night. She joins us now from Melbourne. Ash, you followed Julia Gillard for most of the campaign when you weren't following Tony Abbott. Did you think it would come to this? I mean, a hung parliament scenario, all the polls were close. I guess we should have seen this coming, but do you think Julia Gillard was prepared for this?
Look, I think that most of the Labor staffers that we'd been travelling with over the last few weeks did think that Labor would end up in front at the end of all this. And you're right, the polls were so close the whole way through, but the general feeling was, well, it's very difficult to unseat a government that's only been in for one term. So I think among all of the journalists following on the bus and the planes around the country over the last 5 weeks was that Labor would end up in front today. Obviously that didn't happen, and the Labor supporters that were gathered at the Melbourne Convention Centre last night, well, they were in really a bit of shell shock. The mood there was very sombre. Everybody really shaking their heads and just wondering how it had got to that, considering the highs that Labor was on in 2007 and just the depths that we saw last night. It was really a dramatic turnaround. Of course, nationally it looks like Labor's suffered a swing of over 5% against it. Victoria, a different story though. Labor a swing towards it in this state, picking up, as you've mentioned, a couple of those key seats, McEwen and Latrobe. But the seat of Melbourne, where I'm in right now, of course, a huge win for the Greens. They're thrilled with Adam Bandt's result in that seat, becoming the first Greens MP to be elected to the lower house. A swing of 13%, the Greens are saying today. And Bob Brown is coming here to Melbourne to join the party today. He'll be holding a news conference with Adam Bandt a little later on this afternoon. A few firsts, you've been mentioning some of them this morning. If Ken White gets in, of course, the first Indigenous MP. We've got the first Muslim MP in New South Wales, and Ed Husic for Labor in Chifley. Also the youngest MP we've seen in the Parliament, Wyatt Roy, up in Queensland for the LNP in the seat of Longman, has also got in as well. But I think now, looking forward, of course, Labor is going to be looking at how the campaign was run. Last night we saw the former Labor MP for Bennelong, who was ousted last night, Maxine McHugh, have a real slap at the way Labor ran its national campaign, criticising the way that Labor acted when it came to the emissions trading scheme and putting that off for another couple of years, also pointing out the Rudd factor and pointing to that as one of the reasons she may have lost her seat too. So Labor's going to be doing a lot of soul searching over the coming weeks, regardless, and months and perhaps years, regardless of even if they get over the line. They've got a lot of thinking to do about how this campaign was run nationally.
Yeah, I note Ash Karl Batar, the Labor Secretary, has been talking to Laurie Oakes on the Nine Network this morning, and he's blaming those leaks, which were devastating for Labor in the early part of the campaign. He's not acknowledging that the execution of Kevin Rudd was the reason, but the leaks were the reason. And it was a lost week and a half for Labor. In fact, some in Labor are saying that it's, it was the worst week in Labor politics in some 20 years. So they want to shoulder the blame without naming him on Kevin Rudd, who they believe was behind these leaks. But others, of course, will say it was the decision to get rid of Kevin Rudd that caused all of this. We had an argument here amongst our panellists last night about whether Labor would have lost with Kevin Rudd or not. And those who supported the decision to get rid of him believe that, things would have been far worse. They would have been wiped out in Western Australia. They still would have suffered all these losses in Queensland. But they would have had a worse result. It's all a bit of a hypothetical argument, really. Kieran, the messages that we were getting, and Ashley no doubt was getting in recent days from Labor, was very much that they were worried about being seen to be in front. They'd get a kicking if they were seen to be in front of protest vote.
And in the context of what Karl Batar said, they're spinning enormously on this, and they were last night as well, because while the leaks were bad, it was in the second week. And then there was another 3 weeks, and they stuffed that up as well. They stuffed up the Climate Change Citizens Assembly. It was a disaster. The Parramatta to Epping rail link, disaster. I mean, it's fair enough to say the leaks were bad.
And the real Julia, fake Julia.
I mean, the campaign, there's got to be some flack delivered elsewhere and not just on those leaks. It is enormous spin. I think we've got a bit of Karl Batar this morning, the campaign director of the ALP on the Nine Network.
For 7 to 10 days, when all the focus was on leaks, our vote took such an amazing hit that there was one point in the campaign where I suspended all research because it was pretty much a waste of money. We were facing swings of anywhere between 10 and 12% across the country. So you look at Labor's campaign, and Labor's campaign only really started from week 3. So we had 3 weeks, a 3-week campaign. 3 weeks ago, Tony Abbott thought he was a shoo-in. It's part of the reason why they sort of started stage managing him and pulling him off the stage and taking a really low-risk strategy. But in that 3 weeks, Julia Gillard did an amazing job to come back from the Labor Party facing absolute wipeout to being neck and neck on election day and actually controlling or getting a majority of the Australian public's vote on election day as well.
Yeah, Ashley, I'm keen to see what you think of that comment there from Karl Batar this morning.
Well, look, I think it's right. The first couple of weeks were completely a waste of time for Labor because of those leaks and also the Rudd factor, Kevin Rudd hanging over the shoulder of Julia Gillard. We also saw, of course, the real lack of communication between Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd about whether or not he was going to help campaigning or not. I think you guys probably have the same sense as I do about the source of the leaks. Of course, no one's saying this publicly and no one will put the blame on Kevin Rudd publicly for those leaks, but all of the Labor sources and staffers I've been speaking to in the last few weeks, nobody seems to be in any doubt that it was Kevin Rudd behind those very damaging leaks. So I think there will be a lot of finger pointing and a lot of blame heading in his direction at the moment. Of course, looking at just the polls in the last couple of days, we saw a couple of leaks of Labor internal polling in the last couple of days showing that it was really that tight and that Labor could lose. So I think that Labor was worried right towards the end there that there was this voter fatigue, I guess, with this whole thing, that voters were just assuming that Labor was going to get over the line in the end. And that's when we saw that really negative turn from Julia Gillard right at the end, warning about the risk, she says, Tony Abbott would bring to this country when it came to issues like work choices, for example. I think they were worried that voters were going to be too complacent at the end and they wanted to really shake it up and say, no, this is really tight. But that message didn't come through. I think all of us really did think that Labor would be the ones that would be standing here today saying that they just got in narrowly, but still up in the air.
David Lipson is with us from Brisbane. David, you know, you followed these two leaders for the last 5 weeks as well. How do you contrast the sort of campaigns that Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott had?
Well, they were very similar in that they were both pretty constrained, very restrained, in fact, from both sides. Julia Gillard, of course, said that she was going to become the real Julia after a couple of weeks. But apart from a few media appearances or appearances on media buses and a couple of days of sort of, interesting antics, if you like, interrupting piece to cameras and kind of off-the-cuff comments and the like, a bit of a pick-up of the pace. But then really it just went back to the way it was. And it was a very similar situation with Tony Abbott. I suppose with hindsight now, the Abbott campaign, the whole strategy can really be sort of laid bare and analysed quite well, because the slogan, of course, was real action, and to go along with that slogan were dozens and dozens of images of Tony Abbott in action, you know, whether it was driving a giant mining truck or on his bike or pushing a billy cart around a school. It was all action from Tony Abbott, and those images were
as well.
Mate, I'll tell you, that was full of action and a tough ride for all of us. And look, he handled that pretty well. It was a bit of a risk, you'd have to say. It was clever, but it was risky, because if in that final press conference he didn't make much sense, if he was tripped up on any of the questions, then really it could have been a disaster for Tony Abbott. The whole mad monk thing may have come to the fore, but he handled himself pretty well. I think he was jacked
battling
up on
a
Red
cold
Bull
too in the last couple of days, I understand too. Is that right?
Yeah, he seemed to be, and he got croaky at some points, and you know but again, you know, he kept his mind together. So all credit to him, but also all credit to Julia Gillard. And you heard Karl Batar there just say that she really did an amazing job, particularly in those last few weeks of the campaign. It would be hard to remember any political campaigner, any leader in history that has had such a difficult campaign, so many distractions, so many problems thrown at her, and really throughout she was pretty much unflappable. In all those news conferences where she was asked about the leaks, where she was asked about Kevin Rudd, when she was asked about Mark Latham, all of those things, she pretty much had an answer for everything, and
even at those people's...
and never really stumbled.
Yeah, even at those people's forums, the one in Rooty Hill where she was copying it from the crowd, she did a pretty good job of, of staying on message and being polite as she could be. Let's have a look at Tony Abbott last night. He might have been croaky towards the end of the campaign, but he was in full voice, and the crowd was in even fuller voice as they cheered on and celebrated this huge success for the coalition. They're not quite there yet, but they were certainly cheering on their hero of the night, Tony Abbott, as he tried to just calm the crowd and not get too carried away. Have a look.
A government which found it very hard to govern effectively with a majority of 17 seats will never be able to govern effectively in a minority.
Kieran, you were there last night with Tony Abbott. John Howard was there. You spoke to him as well. For the Liberal Party faithful, this sort of turnaround since the 2007 result, they wouldn't have dreamed of.
No, I think there was a bit of
months ago.
I think there was a bit of disbelief because, you know, we've often said that the Labor Party underestimated Tony Abbott, and they did in terms of his capacity to step up as he did in this campaign. But his colleagues underestimated him as well, and I think many in the Liberal Party underestimated him because
not only underestimated his discipline and focus and attack, ability to go the negative attack, but his appeal to voters, I think, has been the one thing that a lot of commentators, his colleagues, Labor, have all underestimated. But clearly, he's not the turn-off that a lot of people thought.
Not at all, no. And he's reined in a lot of his the loose comments and ill discipline that we saw back in 2007. If you had to compare two campaigns and see a more stark contrast by an individual, 2007 where Abbott made the Bernie Banton gaffe, the Nicola Roxon gaffe, it was a disaster. This year, he's learned from all of his mistakes, and it was an amazing show of discipline by him. And I think surprised not just the Labor Party, but as I say, his own colleagues, because they rebuffed him only, a year before he got the job, and then when he got the job, he got it by one vote.
Yeah, and don't forget after the last election in 2007 when he did put his hand in the air for the leadership in a contest that had Malcolm Turnbull and Brendan Nelson in it. He quickly put it back down again and didn't actually contest that because he didn't have support.
No.
People laughed at the suggestion of Tony Abbott as leader. Look at him now.
Absolutely,
it's
and I think he's surprised maybe even himself at how effective and how focused he was during this.
Well, another man, of course, who'll be happy with the result so far for the coalition is Brian Loughnane, the Liberal Party director, who'll be taking some credit for keeping this campaign. While there was criticism early that they weren't prepared for the campaign, certainly they've done a good job on staying on message. Did it mean that Brian Loughnane had to control Tony Abbott? Well, this morning he says no. And what about the negotiations and what the prospects are of the coalition forming a minority government with these independents in the lower house? And here's what Brian Loughnane had to say to Laurie Oakes on the Nine Network.
Look, I think the only way in which Australia will have stable government going forward for any period of time is if it's formed by Tony Abbott and the coalition. Labor's divided and dysfunctional. Any government formed by Labor will be divided and dysfunctional. Already this morning we're seeing the backbiting and the retribution starting. The only team that's united and with a very clear plan to take Australia forward is the coalition, and the only way in which Australia will have a stable and secure government going forward for the next 3 years is if it's formed by the coalition under Tony Abbott's leadership.
Well, who's going forward now? Brian Loughnane there pitching along the lines of a stable government is only the coalition can deliver. Tony Abbott said that last night too, didn't he? He said because of this huge swing against Labor, they cannot form a government, that they've lost that ability to form a government.
And it was strong language too, lost their majority, lost their legitimacy. And that's an important word. And it was intriguing that in our chat with John Howard, just after, it would have been probably 12:30, maybe just before 12:30 a.m, it was after midnight, John Howard did not look tired at all. He was pumped.
And he used the same lines.
He used the same line word for word, and that reinforced my view, and I think our collective view, that John Howard has played a big part in this campaign. He is Tony Abbott's mentor, and I think he's not only is his political mentor, and I think he was during this campaign. I'd love to know just how often Mr. Howard and Tony Abbott were in consultation throughout this.
Helen Daly is with us from Tony Abbott's seat of Warringah in Sydney. And Helen, any sign there of Tony Abbott yet this morning? And how do you think he'd be feeling?
Oh, look, he'd be feeling quite elated, I think, David. There is no sign of him yet. We understand he was on the phone to Tony Windsor at 1:30 in the morning this morning. So, you know, his night didn't end early last night by any means. He possibly had a bit of a sleep in, I can't say for sure. But we're down at his Queenscliff Beach, the surf club here, where he is a member and where he voted yesterday. We were, I suppose, hoping to get a glimpse of the red Speedos, but not so yet. He may have sneaked out in the dark and had a bike ride, but my suspicion is that he hasn't actually been out this morning. But look, it's interesting, a couple of points there. Obviously, both sides from both those campaign directors are spinning their way out of what happened to Labor and what is happening to the Liberals and the coalition. But I think it's all very well for Carl Bittar to actually, you know, try and say that it was the damaging leaks. And there's no doubt that they were so damaging, because it was the first time really sort of St. Julia had been questioned. Her credibility and her passion had actually been questioned. But, you know, you'd have to ask the question of Carl Bittar, how did Labor get to that point where a first-term government that, as Kieran mentioned before, came in a Rudd slide in the 07 election, how did they get to the point where the campaign, they went into this, they had 17 seats that Tony Abbott had to get. Everyone seemed to be saying, oh, it's going to be very hard to win 17 seats. You know, he's almost done it. So how did Labor even get to that point? It was not just the campaign. There were mistakes made right from really late last year, and probably even right through last year, when so much time was being spent on preparation for Copenhagen, the CPRS, and we know that perhaps the community wasn't taken along enough with the Labor government. Kevin Rudd didn't explain his cause enough. That all ended up in tears, as we know. But another couple of points, David and Kieran, from the discussions you had just an hour ago with Bob Katter and with Rob Oakeshott. I think, firstly, neither party should get ahead of itself. Brian Loughnane there was saying that, you know, his side is the only one who can form stable government. I don't think either side has proven yet to those independents who are going to have a huge say in the new government, either side has proved who will be forming stable government, because in a sense at this stage it will be proving to those independents that you have the policies that they want. And as you were saying with both those members, they want policies. And Rob Oakeshott did vote for the CPRS. He wants movement on climate change. He also told me just a week ago that they are still in the land in Lyne, the seat of Lyne. They are still in the land of dropouts with their phone and with their internet connections. They don't even get ADSL2. He was saying at that stage, just a week out from the election, he favours the National Broadband Network. They want action on that front. So it's going to be really interesting to see, and it looks like going into the future that whichever side of politics can prove to those possibly 5 independent members that they can form stable government by providing the sorts of policies that those members want for their constituencies, and their constituencies come first and then the rest of Australia, will be able to then possibly prove to the Governor-General that they can form a government. And I guess you know, it's interesting, David, we should probably look at what happened in the British elections just a few months ago. And of course, when it came to the end, Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democrats played an enormous role and is now part of the government. But in terms of what happened with Gordon Brown and Labor, he put his deal, and there was a lot of toing and froing for quite some time, and he said he wouldn't join with Labor. Labor had the first opportunity to form a government with the Lib Dems because Gordon Brown had been the Prime Minister, and in the end they couldn't form a deal, even though Gordon Brown did offer to go. And the Lib Dems formed the government with the Conservatives. So there could be some less.
Australia is staring down the barrel of its first hung parliament in 70 years, with neither major party winning enough seats in last night's election to govern outright. There was a swing to the coalition, but not enough to snatch victory. And with a record number of pre-poll and thousands of postal votes yet to be counted, a final result may not be known until the end of the week. Forming a minority government will depend most likely on which party is able to woo Greens MP Adam Brandt and 3, possibly 4 independents.
Julia Gillard was all smiles as she stopped for a morning coffee in Melbourne with partner Tim Matheson.
A strong coffee for you this morning, Prime Minister?
I always like my coffee, so I'm looking forward to one this morning.
Chatting with locals and posing for photos, you could have been forgiven for thinking this was a celebration. But with neither major party winning enough seats to govern outright, Miss Gillard faces an uncertain future. Australia now facing its first hung parliament since World War II.
There are anxious days ahead, but in those anxious days, I'll keep fighting.
We stand ready to govern, and we stand ready to offer the Australian people stable, predictable and competent government.
The balance of power now rests with independents Rob Oakeshott, Tony Windsor, Bob Katter and possibly Andrew Wilkie. The Greens' Adam Bant will also feature after winning the seat of Melbourne from Labor.
You would expect the coalition to have 73 seats, Labor to have 72, and the five, the gang of five that have emerged as the power brokers, the kingmakers in this situation.
Bob Katter, member for the Queensland seat of Kennedy, says rural issues will dictate who he sides with.
There's no way that I'm coming into some sort of a deal if I personally have the power, unless I come out of it with the right for rural Australia to survive and have some of their freedoms restored.
New South Wales' Rob Oakeshott says he'll back whoever can provide a stable government.
If I'm in play, my job description's simple. That is to focus on my electorate and my country through the parliament. I will want stable government and I will want a parliament that can deliver outcomes.
The member for Lyne says he'll meet his fellow independents as soon as possible.
This could be, if we can pull it off, a very exciting and enlightened moment in Australian public policy, and we can actually have a parliament that is focused on getting outcomes for Australia, not focused along political party lines or party loyalties.
Both major parties could still govern, but the opposition leader says Labor has lost its legitimacy.
A government which found it very hard to govern effectively with a majority of 17 seats will never be able to govern effectively in a minority.
Nationally, Labor was dealt a swing against it of more than 5%.
Well, state factors obviously stand out in New South Wales and Queensland. In Queensland, it's a huge swing back to the coalition. I mean, 9 seats is a big swag to harvest in a national election. The Rudd factor played strongly in Queensland, there's no doubt about that. And the fact that Labor ran such a problematic campaign.
The man who ran Labor's campaign admits internal leaks hurt the government.
For 7 to 10 days, when all the focus was on leaks, our vote took such an amazing hit that there was one point in the campaign where I suspended all research because it was pretty much a waste of money. We were facing swings of anywhere between 10 and 12% across the country.
The Rudd Labor government came to power with very high expectations. And they were given a go, and basically they failed to deliver.
Vote counting continues, but it could be days before the country's political future becomes clear. Steve Kidner, Sky News.
Prime Minister Julia Gillard says she still has some work to do as she prepares to negotiate with a group of independents to try to form a minority government. Ms Gillard chatted with well-wishers when she had coffee with partner Tim Matheson at a cafe near their Melbourne home this morning. And Sky News political reporter Ashley Gillen is with the Prime Minister and filed this report.
Julia Gillard came here to her home suburb of Altona today for a nice walk along the pier with her partner Tim. Of course, last night at the Labor Party function in Melbourne, the mood was very sombre. Labor Party staffers seemed quite upset about the result. Obviously, we still don't know what that is, but it is so tight, and Labor is certainly at a big risk right now of losing government. It's a huge turnaround from just months ago when Labor was well ahead in the polls. But of course, in terms of campaigning today, you can see the media still following every move Julia Gillard is making. It's important for both Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard to appear upbeat at this stage to show voters that they are still ready to lead and they believe, they're confident that they can still form government. Later today, Julia Gillard will speak with the media. This was only a picture opportunity. A little later, we know that tomorrow morning Julia Gillard will be flying to Canberra. Now, some of the the key independents, Rob Oakeshott, Tony Windsor, Bob Catter. They're all going to Canberra tonight to start nutting out which side they may go with in this election, and they'll probably be coming up with a list of demands to try to milk the position they're in right now. So Julia Gillard will fly to Canberra, no doubt, to meet with those key independents tomorrow morning as she tries to secure a second term for Labor. Following Julia Gillard's campaign in Altona in Melbourne, I'm Ashley Gillan reporting for Sky News.
And Labor has suffered a blow in Western Australia, almost certain to lose the seat of Perth-based Hasluck, one of the key battlegrounds in yesterday's poll. Sky News reporter Adam Harvey is in Perth and filed this report.
There weren't high expectations for the ALP in Western Australia, and those very low expectations have proved to be quite prophetic. The ALP only held 4 seats in WA. It looks like after Monday they'll only hold 3 of those seats. The ALP will not take the seat of Canning. It's almost certain. Alana McTiernan, the former state government minister, has lost out to Don Randall. The ALP will not take the seat of Swan either. It also looks like Tim Hammond, the asbestos litigation lawyer who's been working so hard in that seat for the past 4 months, didn't get enough of a swing to take the seat from Steve Irons. So it looks like those 2 seats will not be won by the ALP. It also looks like a likely coalition victory in the seat of Hasluck, where Indigenous candidate Ken Wyatt could take that seat. He's about 300 votes ahead at this stage after about 70% of the vote has been counted. Vote counting resumes again on Monday, and he is quietly confident. I spoke to him earlier.
I'd have to be quietly confident, but I won't be sure until that final vote comes in and the AEC declaration is made.
If Mr Wyatt does win, he'll be the first Indigenous... If Mr Wyatt does win, he'll become the first Indigenous member of the House of Representatives in Australia's history. He says that he is very proud of that milestone. He says that one of the issues that he'll be working with Tony Abbott, if the coalition does indeed win victory, is the issue of Indigenous health. He is, of course, the former Director of Indigenous Health with the WA Health Department. Adam Harvey, Sky News, Perth.
And as expected, Queensland turned on the ALP yesterday with the loss of 9 seats. Wyatt Roy, Theresa Gambaro and Warren Entsch were among the stars for the coalition as the Rudd factor was realised. Steve Stockwell is a political analyst from Griffith University and joins us now from Brisbane this afternoon. And Steve, the ALP's fears for Queensland were certainly well-founded.
They were, and the Rudd factor had a major impact on Queensland. And I'll tell you why. Because 3 years ago there was a massive swing to the Labor Party because of Kevin Rudd in Queensland. Swings of 10%, one even of 14%. And so you'd expect there to be some wind back from that anyway, even if Kevin Rudd was there. But in his absence, in the leadership position, there was a stampede away from Labor.
And so, in effect, it was a Rudd slide again, but in the other direction. How big a role did it play?
It played a very, very major role, and if the ALP wants to keep trying to kid itself that it wasn't a major factor, certainly in Queensland, and I suspect elsewhere in Australia, then they're not doing the work they need to do to heal after this, the response they've had at the ballot box yesterday. I was quite surprised last night listening to the Prime Minister speaking that she didn't apologise. She didn't say, look, there's a lesson and we've learnt it from what happened to the ALP yesterday. To see a first-term government kicked out so easily, like, not yet kicked out, but no longer to have their majority, is a truly astounding thing. Hasn't happened since the Depression, and I think that that's a factor that people haven't taken into account. That out in the regional Australia and throughout Queensland, people are still doing it quite tough. It's not a full-blown depression, but people are still doing it quite tough because of the global financial meltdown, and that was a factor that came through, and Labor never got its act together to really hammer home the fact that, how bad things could be if they hadn't intervened in the economy the way they did.
Yes, certainly. And what's your take on the role of the independents in a hung parliament? If we look at who they are, Oakeshott, Katter, Windsor, all certainly strong-willed.
I don't think we should underestimate the independence of these group of independents. They've always shown that they're very free-thinking people. I mean, Bob Katter, I don't think is ever going to vote down a Conservative government, but he's also committed to work with the other two, and the other two are, certainly have interests in changing the quality of the parliament. That's what Tony Windsor did when he was on the crossbenchers in New South Wales. He actually did quite a lot of work to improve the quality of parliamentary debate, and I think that will be high on his agenda. I mean, one potential outcome of this is if Labor does scrape its way back to having 75 seats, is that they could offer the speakership to someone like Tony Windsor, from the, or one of the other independents, and that they would be able to, and Tony Windsor could steer the improved quality of Parliament from that point of, holding that position.
Yes, certainly offers on the table there, and the independents are all from the bush, and this goes back to what you were talking about before, but the focus will have to return to regional Australia, it would seem.
Well, I think that regional Australia has decided many elections before, and it'll certainly, have a major role to play in how things move, the politics of the country, and how they move from here. And I think that the thing that has really galvanised the bush has been the mining tax. Another thing that the Labor Party has never really sold particularly well. I mean, that it's a tax, why was this tax, seen as the be-all and end-all? There's probably very good reasons, but they were never explained to the people. So we're starting to see a number of things where Labor's failure to explain and failure to get the message across has put them in this situation. And that's the sort of thing that they should be thinking about and talking about now.
And if we look at the stories within the story last night, Wyatt Roy not only voting for the first time but also getting elected to Parliament. Quite a few funny tweets, for example, on this, saying his parents let him stay up late to vote and to win.
That's right. Well, I mean, you'd have to say that observing the campaign close to the ground here, that that Wyatt Roy has had a run a very good campaign. It wasn't slick, but it was very heartfelt, and he probably was not going to win if there hadn't been a stumble from the sitting member, where he told an unemployed father of a disabled child, that he was a bit slack because he hadn't got the medical treatment that he was asking for assistance to get. And so, Wyatt was ready to come through, and after that stumble, and keep with a very professional, very personable kind of character he projects. And I think that the people, particularly the older people of the area, found him very concerned about their actual welfare, and that counted for a lot in that seat.
Definitely. And just finally, the Rudd factor aside, where did Labor essentially go wrong in this campaign?
Well, I think that their failure to clarify, what was so good about their policies, about the mining tax, for example, was a crucial part of the problem. And the items that they were campaigning on, that they were putting forward as their positive story, really, certainly by the last week, had to come together in a mantra, and so that the Prime Minister could just keep repeating, the reasons why people should vote for her in a simple, succinct and way that got through the clutter, the media clutter, and saying, oh, you can't risk Tony Abbott, and things like that, were hopeless. Whereas Abbott had that down pat, and there was this constant, these are the reasons to vote for me. And when you're trying to get through to people through the media, you've got to have very simple messages that you just keep banging away on, but they've got to be messages that work. And that, I think, is the big problem that the ALP is facing, that their policies just haven't been explained to people, and people are going, well, where's the follow-through? And that goes back to the grocery watch and fuel watch policies from the last campaign that never saw realisation. And people are quite rightly asking, well, why should we give you another chance? I guess that was what they had to answer in the last week of the campaign with a strong mantra, and that's what they failed to do.
Some big lessons to take out of this election. Steve Stockwell at Griffith University, thank you. General election. But despite contact with both parties, no solid agreement has been reached.
It's clear that no party will be able to pass legislation through the Senate without the support of the Greens or the other major party. So the question before all of us is this: which party is better able to form a stable and effective government in the national interest? Which party can proceed and process the business of the Australian people and get legislation passed through the Parliament?
And while Adam Bandt says it's his intention to support Labor in a hung parliament, Greens leader Bob Brown says his party is keeping its options open.
Gillard, they very well know our platform for the election, but it's very early. It's jumping the gun, and nor did we talk about any policy issues that were part of the election firmament. It's too early to do that because we don't know the result.
The Greens are yet to meet with the opposition leader to discuss possible options to break the political deadlock. And speaking in Sydney this afternoon, Tony Abbott said a minority Labor government would be chronically divided and dysfunctional. He told reporters Australians expected change in government following last night's historic result.
OK, well, look, thanks for being here. I'm just going to make a brief statement and take 2 or 3 questions. It's been a long campaign, and I know everyone's feeling the stresses and strains of it all. Look, when the government lost its majority, it also lost its legitimacy. The one unambiguous fact to emerge from yesterday's election is that there are about 500,000 more votes for the coalition than for the Labor Party. The important thing is that Australia now has competent and stable government for the next 3 years. It's almost inconceivable that any Labor government emerging from this election could deliver competent and stable government. It's certain that any Labor government emerging from yesterday will be chronically divided and dysfunctional. Just to give one illustration, just 8 weeks ago, the government politically executed Kevin Rudd. Now it seems Kevin Rudd is to be a very senior minister in any Labor government. This is no way to run a government, and it's no way to treat the country.
Have you spoken to the independents, and what are your plans? Will you go to Canberra to meet them in person?
I have spoken briefly to each of the 3 incumbent independents, and I've had a brief conversation with Senator Brown of the Greens. I've left messages for others. And look, I've made it very clear that I'm looking forward to those discussions, but they're really just discussions to begin discussions. Swing against this government. It is historically unprecedented for a first-term government to receive the kind of rebuff that the Rudd-Gillard government received yesterday, and I think that the public expect a change of government as a result of yesterday's result.
Well, in this parliament, it may well be a Green in the lower house that makes the difference over who forms government, and even if that isn't the case, it'll be the Greens in the upper house that now have the balance of power that decide what legislation passes and what doesn't. This is going to be uncertain times, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about that with the panel. That's my say. You're watching The Contrarians. Well, joining me for this special issue here in the Sky News studio is Sunday Telegraph columnist Greg O'Mahony. Greg, thanks for being here.
Pleasure, Pat.
And joining us out of the News Limited studio is Chief Political Reporter for the Daily Telegraph, Simon Benson. Simon, thanks for your time as well.
No worries. Hi, Pete.
Simon, I'll come to you first. I know you're pretty busy, so we're lucky to have you here at this particular point in time, but you're busy writing about what the hell is going on. Take us through it. What has happened as of this election last night?
Well, I don't know. I haven't even started writing yet. But, you know, I just listened to Tony Abbott before, and I was listening to Julia Gillard earlier than that. And it's just a bizarre situation. Is that both of them are claiming some sort of legitimacy. I mean, I know as Julia Gillard was claiming a legitimacy based on two-party preferred. Which of course is is a coalition of the Greens and Labor, if you like, and then and Tony Abbott's arguing on the basis of the greater primary vote. You know, there's no rules or conventions around it, so it really it's going to be. I reckon it's going to be a couple of weeks before we know anything, because the independents have all said...
that's Simon from a national economy perspective. What's going to happen to the share market on Monday? What's going to happen with us being in caretaker mode for that long? State governments, this has happened before, I know, but that's a pretty different level of ball game, isn't it?
I suspect there'll probably be a deal done earlier than that. But the problem, you know, and you would know this as well as I do, the problem is that for the independents, there's a lot at stake for them, and some of these seats aren't going to be decided. Some of the remaining seats aren't going to be decided for a while yet. So for them, there's a risk, I suppose, for some of them coming down on the wrong side, to form a minority government, or to do a deal with one or other side, if those numbers in the parliament change in the space of the next 10 days. So, but yeah, I mean, obviously you're going to have the current government will continue until such time as a deal can be struck or the writs are returned, and look, by definition of the rules, I think that it'll be, you know, they can go to November before the Parliament has to come back. I mean, realistically, this could all get tested on the floor of Parliament in late November.
Yeah. Well, Greg O'Money, we talk about the idea that the Greens will now have control of the balance of power, but crikey, the Greens only actually get that control come July next year. We might have had another election before then if they can't sort this hung parliament out in the lower house.
I think they have to sort it out. And I think the interesting thing is, as Simon just points out, we do have two sides that both claim this moral legitimacy. That the most obvious recent precedent is the UK. And in that election, Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democrats he had the balance of power. He became the kingmaker. Most pundits thought the last thing he would do is forge an alliance with the Tories. What did he do? He said he'd taken note of the fact that it was Labor that lost more seats, that there was a big swing against Labor. He didn't want to stand in the way of the will of the people, and he forged what many perceived to be a very unholy alliance with the Conservatives. I suspect that will be playing on the minds of the independents over the next few days.
Simon, there's a few commentators that have got a bit of egg on their face from this result. I know one commentator for The Australian, who does a little bit of work for Sky News, thought that Julia Gillard would increase her majority at this election. It looks like she'll struggle to even hang on as a minority Prime Minister.
Paul Kelly?
No, it wasn't Paul Kelly. Another slightly younger journo at The Australian. But what do you think? I mean, is this a shock to you, or were you thinking this is a likely course of action because Labor was so on the nose?
Look, you know, and with all due respect to my colleagues on the other mastheads, if you, and I'm assuming you did, pick up a copy of the Daily Telegraph yesterday, that was on our front page. I mean, we went with that, and only on the basis, and I think I editorialised it earlier in the week, is that you know, I think you had to remove the national polls from what was going on up until the end. I think the news poll, the last news poll, was probably the closest. But it looks
like it was almost dead on, doesn't it? I mean, he said, I think, 50.2 to 49.8, and that is roughly, I think, how the two-party vote's been predicted.
Well, I'm surprised that they didn't make a bigger call based on that fact alone. I mean, everything was pointing to.
Well, mate, we're not a tabloid at The Australian. You know, Simon, it might be your way to make the big calls. We're a broadsheet. We take our news seriously.
Oh well, no, we're a quality tabloid, Peter, as you know, and you've made calls before. But anyway, look. No, I don't think it's a surprise. I don't think it's a surprise at all. I think what's surprising, though, is that what is surprising, the claims that are being made around New South Wales at the moment that the Labor Party actually did well because they only lost one MP but on paper 4 seats. I mean, the primary vote in New South Wales the swing against Labor was about 6.5%. I mean, it's diabolical. And some of the swings in some of those safe Labor seats in sort of southwest Sydney were enormous. I think they're unprecedented. So, you know, I don't think it was a surprise. I think, you know, everything was sort of pointing in this direction later in the week, and so everyone's woken up today and sort of gone, shock horror, we've got a hung parliament. But, you know, I think it was probably inevitable eventually that it would come to this, because there's so little difference now between the Conservative side of politics and a Labor government under, you know, a dominated sort of right-wing machine, that really they've been moving, you know, converging to a point where they've become very similar on policy, very similar on ideology, you've got to say, with a lot of things. Is it surprising that people are a bit fed up with the two-party system and have decided to whack in a big protest vote? No, I don't think so.
Probably not. I think to pick up on that, I think the country's in a very strange place right now. I mean, before people went to bed last night, I think it's fair to say Julia Gillard effectively gave a quasi-concession speech. Tony Abbott...
Well, she spoke first. I mean, that's the traditional spot where the concession speech comes first, followed by the victor coming in second. And it really felt like that, didn't it? You had Julia Gillard effectively conceding, but not really. And then you had Tony Abbott coming out to the spores of victory, even though we didn't know whether he was actually going to become Prime Minister. Today, however, we've seen a situation where both leaders are really trying to make the point that they think that they can form a government. There's that cold light of day scenario happening where they both probably realise what's at stake, as well as Abbott's done. If he doesn't form a government, well, 3 long, lonely years in opposition can be 3 years too long in the toughest job in Australian politics if this cobbled together alliance lasts, if Labor wins. But equally for Gillard, what a joke she turns into if she doesn't manage to get elected at this election. She goes down as the shortest Prime Minister in history other than caretakers. 8 weeks, not even 8 weeks. It'd be embarrassing.
I think that's right, and I think history says that it's a lot easier to go from opposition into minority government than it is to go from majority government into minority government. I think Nick Reiner's government was a classic example of that. That particular government found it a very, very difficult transition to make. And I think, Tony Abbott last night appealed to the audience before him not to engage in premature triumphalism, I think were his words. That's exactly what they did. It was a victor's speech. It was a victor's night, and I think the Australian people are assuming that there's been a change of government.
All right, well, hold that thought, because we do have to go to a commercial break. But just for the viewers, Greg O'Mahony and I were in the tally room last night for Sky. We went and had a few drinks with some of these triumphant Liberals afterwards, as well as some pretty downtrodden Labor people, and they certainly were that on both sides. There was that sense on both sides. We won't go into the Chatham House discussions that were had, but by God, there was certainly a ring of didn't we do well amongst the Liberals, and Labor looked pretty downcast. But today, it seems to be a lot closer than that. They're both trying to find a way to form government. You're watching The Contrarians. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching The Contrarians, where I'm joined here in the Sky News studio by Greg O'Mahony from the Sunday Telegraph, and in the News Limited building by Chief Political Correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, Simon Benson. Simon, you wouldn't have... Greg, let me start with you, actually. We just saw some images before of Tony Abbott exercising the day after the election. He was running. He's like John Howard on steroids, isn't he?
It's unbelievable. I think he should be tested for EPO. I mean, he's coming down. I mean, I think I know exactly where that street is. It's just at the north of Manly.
Unbelievable.
And, he's probably just had the 5 busiest weeks of his life, and how does he unwind and de-stress with with probably a 2-hour run? He is a machine. A man of that age, it's extraordinary. What I wanted to talk about was Kevin Rudd, his speech last night. I saw a replay of it again.
I couldn't work out whether Kevin Rudd's speech was a concession speech or a victory speech. He looked mildly elated at the fact that Labor lost.
He looked like he'd just been installed as Prime Minister again. He could not have looked. He could not have looked happier. He was signing. I saw him signing T-shirts. The Kevin Rudd balloons were around. It was, I'm not sure it's the look that his Labor colleagues would want to see.
Well, let me bring Simon back in. Simon, I mean, where does Kevin Rudd go from here? Clearly, Julia Gillard, if she's going to form a government, she better offer him something he's happy with, because if she doesn't and he decides to leave Parliament, there's no guarantee that Labor would win his seat of Griffith up in Queensland.
No, you're right. I watched last night as well, and all I can say is that it was weird. But and I think I said this on your program a couple of
pretty technical stuff.
to tabloid analysis. But I said 2 weeks ago on your program, I think that Kevin Rudd, you know, theoretically, does have a legitimate right to challenge for the leadership. Now, and you laughed at me. I'm not going to repeat it because you'll just laugh at me again. But I mean, seriously, if they can't form a minority government, I mean, she's gone. I don't know.
Well, isn't that extraordinary? I mean, let me bring Greg in on this. The idea that Labor in 2 months could have burnt through their 2 best leadership prospects. Kevin Rudd, whatever you thought of him, he was the guy that beat John Howard in 07.
Yep.
Julia Gillard was the anointed heir apparent through the entirety of the first term until she ended up becoming Prime Minister. Now, win or lose, she is badly damaged. He's gone, in my view. Simon might disagree with me about that. They've burnt through both of them. Who's left? I mean, really, the rest of them are future leaders. There's people there. There's Bill Shorten. There's Tony Burke. Jason Clare well down the track, maybe. But at the end of the day, these guys are a long way off being ready, aren't they?
Well, I think, forget about Kevin Rudd. I think you're right. Julia Gillard has destroyed so much personal political capital in the last 7.5 weeks. She must be individually, in the quieter moments, absolutely devastated. During Rudd's reign, she had so much credibility. She had so much poise. The country and her party looked to her, despite the fact that she wasn't Prime Minister day in, day out. She had a shocking first few weeks before calling an election. The campaign hasn't gone well, not necessarily all for reasons due to her.
Let me jump in, Simon. I mean, she didn't just look all those bad ways as Greg describes, but she was not doing it on her terms, I got the impression. The Julia Gillard that was winning over people like Alan Jones, who was a huge fan of hers before she became Prime Minister, people like that liked a very different Julia Gillard to what we ended up seeing when she became Prime Minister. She was really stifled, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But before I go on, I'm just going to restore my own credibility and say I was only being sort of facetious about Kevin Rudd. But, you know what I'm saying, theoretically. I mean, they dump him to put someone else in and they go even worse. So,
well, if it was the Liberal Party, there'd be room for him to come back probably more than the Labor Party.
Well, absolutely, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that that would ever happen. But you're right. Julia Gillard just appeared, from day one, just turned into another human being. And, every great leader, if we talk about Labor leaders, none of them ever. Bob Hawke never decided to become somebody else. He was successful as leader because he was who he was. Julia Gillard was always popular. And she was an able, competent minister, and probably one of their best. She got through more reform than I'd say any other minister. So why she just turned into something else as soon as she became leader? You'd have to ask the people that probably installed her and then managed her all the way through the campaign.
Well, who are they? Let's name some names here. There's no point in avoiding this being anything other than the Night of the Long Knives. I mean, let's name some names, Simon. You've written a book titled Betrayal, about the chaos inside the New South Wales Labor Party in particular. Who are the people that you would finger as responsible for this downfall of the Labor Party, whether they scrape over the line or not?
Well, the people that I would suspect other people might finger in the Labor Party, and they're obvious. Look, I'd be very surprised if Carl Batar can stay in his job for much longer. The entirety of the last 3 weeks of their campaign was a rewriting of their original campaign, and even Julia Gillard said, I'm taking over the campaign. She basically neutered her campaign director.
But I mean, if I could just jump in there, Simon, I mean, put aside the last 3 weeks of the campaign, the last 48 hours was so forgettable. I mean, there is a woman who has given the best years of her life to last Saturday. Those 2 days leading into Saturday, probably the 2 most important days of her career, she did not turn up. She spoke non-stop about the risk of Abbott getting elected.
There's nothing positive there whatsoever, was there?
Extraordinary. She couldn't speak. She couldn't utter a sentence without the word risk in it.
Yeah. Well, they were just trying to occupy the vacuum left by the advertising blackout, which. But
somebody was telling me, Simon.
They lost.
Somebody was telling me, Simon, a pretty senior source in the Labor Party in New South Wales, was saying that in terms of filling that vacuum when electronic media cuts out in terms of paid advertising at midnight on Wednesday, there was still a few days of the campaign left, as you say. The Liberal Party, all of a sudden, was all over the internet. They had advertisements in the newspapers. Labor didn't muscle up on that front. That was a real lost opportunity, wasn't it?
Right, they lost the campaign in the last 2 days. There is no way that anyone, and I'm sure people will rewrite history on this, but the Liberal Party out-campaigned them. Tony Abbott out-campaigned them in the last 2 days by a factor of 2 to 1. Easily. So they lost the campaign in the last 2 days, I think. Labor.
Simon, let me ask you another question, because I know you've got to go after the next ad break, at which point in time Greg and I are going to discuss some of the key seats left in terms of who can or might form a government. But before letting you go, you mentioned that Karl Batar, according to some people, might be untenable in his position now as National Secretary of the Labor Party. That's, of course, the mastermind behind the campaign, and it would seem the ill-fated campaign. But if he goes, if that's right, if he goes, doesn't that also have a massive ripple effect on the factional power of someone like Mark Arbib? If Karl Batar goes, those two are joined at the hip. Where does that leave Mark Arbib, the factional leader, not just of the New South Wales right, I think, but the national right at the moment?
Yeah, well, he's the convener of the national right, but although I don't know that makes much difference. But look, Mark is going to be targeted. Mark and Karl, they sort of come as a package. And look, Mark has got some issues ahead of him, because there are a lot of people in the party that directly, either rightly or wrongly, blame both those two guys for the problems, not just of the campaign or of the removal of Kevin Rudd, although I don't think anyone would argue that wasn't a good decision.
Yeah, there seems to be universal agreement about that Kevin Rudd, it's good to be rid of him from the Labor perspective, but let's just discuss from there how we managed the removal of him and so forth.
Yeah. Well, there was that, but there was also all the events that led up to the need to remove him in the first place. And, you know, there's a lot of issues around that. But I think it's safe to say that the New South Wales right federally is probably on the brink of blowing itself to smithereens.
Greg O'Mahony, in policy terms, very focused group driven in terms of policy, this Labor Party. Now, we're talking about Labor, but let's not forget that the Liberal Party was a pretty reactionary opposition as well. But focusing on Labor, they're the ones that had the big swing against them. Very focused group led in the way that they seem to be responding to policy. A lot of criticism that they were sort of looking 1 or 2 or 3 steps ahead rather than further afield. Yep. Is this something that has to change whether they scrape over the line or not? Does the Labor Party need to get back to basics and think about what are the traditions that built it over 100 years? What are the philosophical bedrocks that it needs to stick with? Whether they're popular or not, they need to try to make them popular. I mean, isn't that what has made the Labor Party the brand and the successful brand that it has been for so many years?
I think absolutely. And I think the problem with this obsession with focus groups is that focus group results change depending on which company you use, depending on which electorate you target, depending on the demographic bands and the assumptions you make. You get different results. And what that results in is inconsistent policy. And there's been no better example of that in the last 3 years than a party that stood before the people at the last election saying the most important issue, the biggest platform on which we stand, is leading the world on climate change. To go from that position to 3 years later to say we feel so strongly about climate change that what we're going to do is assemble 150 people with no experience and no background in the field to sort of congregate in a town hall on a Wednesday night once a month for a year. I mean, to say that's a backtrack...
Well, that wasn't a joke, because the joke is to pay it too much credit. But, I mean, we had Penny Wong on the panel last night on the Tally Room panel for Sky, and she got pretty close to admitting what a joke that Citizens' Assembly was once all the votes were being counted and no more votes were being cast. But gentlemen, we'll take a break now. Simon, I know that you've got, well, I think somewhere between 9 and 10 articles to go off and write for the Daily Telegraph. We really appreciate your time this close to deadline. Thanks very much for being there. We'll let you go at this ad break. Thanks for your company. And with me, Greg, you'll stay here. We're going to take a look at some of the Sky News exit poll results and look at them in the context, I guess, of what we then saw with the counting, but also some of those key seats that are still up for grabs that could be the difference between which side is able to get over the line and form a minority government. You're watching The Contrarians. Back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching The Contrarians after what was an extraordinary Saturday night election last night. Greg O'Mahony, you were there. You were in the Tally Room floor. I was stuck up on the panel. There was a lot of commotion going on the floor. Look, take us through it. What was it like being down there? What were some of the personalities down there? What was the vibe?
It was pandemonium, to be honest, Pete. It was a bit like Woodstock for librarians. There was so many dozen. I mean, there was by the 1 hour mark, more than 1,200 people had come in and out of the tally room.
Why, if you're a member of the public, would you go and hang out in the tally room?
Well, I can tell you the queues were huge.
Could you get alcohol
It
there?
was 3 degrees outside, and people were queuing up for 45, 50 minutes.
Was there alcohol on service?
There was alcohol.
So it's like a sort of bizarre social club in a sense. You go and you hang out at the tally room, you have a few beers, you watch the results come in.
Yeah, well, there's a real theatre to it, and people arrived during the evening. Politicians are walking around. Alexander Downer walked in, I think, hoping for a hero's welcome, and barely got a...
Downer crept in, no one noticed. But Bob Brown got a hero's welcome. I heard the cheer.
Exactly. That was probably, I think, in terms of the theatre of the evening, that was the high point.
Speaking of heroes welcome, I mean, one of the things that I've found interesting is I completely understand why Liberals, members of the coalition, are very excited about how they did. 6 months ago, they looked like they were going to get wiped out at this election. Now they look like they could well form a minority government. There's even a squeak chance that they could form a majority in their own right if the seats go their way. But that's unlikely. The most likely scenario is that it'll either be a minority government for them or a minority government for Labor. Now, it's hardly a ringing endorsement of the coalition. It's certainly a repudiation of the Labor government, no denying that. But it's hardly a ringing endorsement for Tony Abbott. It's hardly a ringing endorsement for the coalition. This is a pox on both houses, isn't it? I mean, basically, the Liberals are just high-fiving themselves, patting themselves on the back that the electorate doesn't completely despise them.
I think that's right, and it was odd that Tony Abbott, while people were cheering his name, said, "Let's not get carried away. Let's not be prematurely triumphalist." The reality
Fair
is,
enough, you haven't got a majority.
Yeah, well, and the reality is, I think you're right. This election sent a message not to Tony Abbott; it sent a message to the Labor Party. I think if Tony Abbott were here, he has to give the impression that he's about to govern. I think he can't be too bashful. He can't be too shy about the fact that history's calling on him in his own mind. He has to give the impression that he's preparing to govern.
Well, Tony Abbott isn't here. He won't come on our show. We've asked him repeatedly. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's because we're a bit tough on him. But just looking at some of the seats, whether Tony Abbott is going to be our next Prime Minister, there are 3 key seats that I'd like to go through some of the details of. One of them is a seat that the Labor Party holds and needs to hang on to. One of them in particular is a seat that they must hold, which is Corangamite in Victoria. Now, let's just take a look at some of the primary figures for Corangamite. Here they come up now. Now, if Labor doesn't hold this seat, Greg, they do not have any chance of being a minority government, in my opinion. Now, you can see on the primary vote they're down, but clearly those Green preferences are likely to deliver mostly in Labor's way. So if we transfer it now to a 2-party vote, still very tight, but what do you think is going to happen there?
I think, well, the Labor are feeling more positive than the Liberals about this. You're absolutely right, Pete. I was on the same flight as you back from Canberra this morning. A lot of very senior Liberals on that flight, a lot of very senior figures in the Labor Party. Both said it's all eyes are on Corangamite and Brisbane. And I got the impression that Labor is more optimistic on Corangamite, looking at those numbers.
And you can see the numbers. I mean, it's nearly 80% of the vote counted. Now, we're talking a few hundred votes there in terms of difference, but the key issue is going to be when those postal votes come in, isn't it? I mean, they are going to be a real impact. Now, Darren Cheeseman's got the benefit of being the incumbent. That's one benefit, which means they have more postal vote applications that they send out, which should help him. But at the same time, when postal vote applications do come in, it's normally around the 2 or 3 week mark of a campaign. Now, that was a very bad time for the Labor Party.
That's absolutely right. And bear in mind, put aside the uncertainty of the postal votes, we are talking about an electorate here that is as geographically and demographically diverse as any electorate in the country.
OK, let's take a look at Brisbane now, the primary vote in Brisbane. Now, this is one that is currently, I believe, sitting in the column for the Labor Party. For the coalition, I should say. Now, you can see why Arch Bevis is a mile behind on primaries, but gee, there is a large number of votes that are there for the Greens. So if we go to the 2-party result, you'll see what happens. A mass of those Green votes make it a very close contest. Now, Labor is more bullish about Brisbane now, Greg, than it was halfway through the night. Last night.
I think that's true. I spoke to a number of people by 10 o'clock last night who had pretty much given up on Brisbane, and I think certainly on our panel there was absolute shock from Paul House.
And the issue here, again, is postal votes. Does the incumbent get the advantage of them, or does the challenger, a former MP herself, does she do better because of the timing of when those postal votes went out? Now, the last one that we want to look at as a key seat is Hasluck in Western Australia. Now, this is one that I think that the Labor Party have been too bearish about. I think that the Labor Party are a very good chance in this seat because when you look at it, they're only behind by about 2,500 votes to the Liberal, Ken White. If he wins, he'll be the first Aboriginal elected member of the lower house. Now, Tony Abbott talked about that in his victory speech, about the pride of him becoming the first elected Aboriginal MP in the lower house if he wins. But you can see on this two-party vote, that is an incredibly tight contest. And I wouldn't be at all surprised with the handfuls of votes we're talking about for that kind of margin if the city member Sharon Jackson had a more organised postal vote campaign than Ken White, and therefore is able to creep back over the line in that seat.
Well, that is wafer thin. I think you are right, but the one thing I would say is that I understand Ken White ran a very efficient campaign. He's ahead of Indigenous health in New South Wales and WA, had a lot of resources and logistics behind him. He may well have harnessed postal votes in a way that most non-incumbents do.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the Sky News exit poll that was done. We've got some interesting information. This was talked about last night, but I think in the context of what we now know happened, with Labor falling short of a majority in its own right, it's worth taking a look at some of these factors. What if Kevin Rudd was still PM? This was the question that people at the exit poll were asked about whether they would be more likely to vote one way or the other if Kevin Rudd was still PM. Now, you can see that Labor's vote, according to those figures, plus 8%, Coalition -3, Greens -4, others -3. Greg, what do you take out of that?
For me, the big one is the Greens. I think that the Greens were have been a huge beneficiary of what happened to Kevin Rudd. I think the happiest guy in the country the night he was knifed was Bob Brown. I think it's a bit unfair to blame people like Habib and say that Labor would have been re-elected if Rudd wasn't assassinated. Labor was...
You're just saying that because you had a beer with him last night.
Well, he seemed like a nice guy, but that's not the point. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't say it. But I think that Labor received rejection on three fronts last night, partly because of what it did to Mr Rudd, but I think primarily because of its policies and some of its policy backflips and failures the last few years.
I'm glad you mentioned policies, because the last graphic that I want to look at while we've still got time is this issue of the big issues. These are the 5 big issues in descending order according to voter preferences that were the issues that mattered to them at this election. You can see economic management up front. You would think from some of the news poll surveys, Greg, that would suggest that Labor would have done all right, because they were actually doing well on economic management compared to most elections. Health and education are Labor issues. Cost of living, admittedly, Labor had a problem on it. Now, I think asylum seekers at number 5, even though it's only 17%, I think that for that 17%, it was like a really core issue that they decided quite strongly to vote for Abbott on. And maybe that was, even though it was sitting as far down the line as that, it was a pretty big issue. You could say the same for the mining tax as well, probably.
You're right about refugees. That's something I noticed on the tally room floor last night. You'd ask people, how do you want the night to pan out? And they would say, well, don't really care. I just want to make sure the boats stop coming here. People are so worked up, I think, irrationally about it, but there's absolutely no doubt.
I think irrationally as well, but at the end of the day, Tony Abbott said that he's going to repay the debt, he's going to stop the boats, he's going to stop the big new tax, and I think there was other stuff in there as well.
It's a nuanced message.
It is very nuanced, like his campaign, like Labor's campaign for that matter. They were moving forward the whole time, but at the end of the day, it's now looking like both sides will have an opportunity here to not deliver on their promises at this election. If we end up in a situation where the Labor Party wins in a minority government, or whether the Liberal Party wins in a minority government, they've both got excuses now not to deliver on all their promises. We are right out of time. Greg O'Mahony from the Sunday Telegraph, appreciate your company.
Pleasure, Pete.
You've been watching a special edition on Sunday of The Contrarians. We'll be back again next week on Friday. Thanks for your company.